Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Identity Radicals. Excited about today's episode with a longtime friend and colleague, Sam Curry, Global VP and CISO and residence at Zscaler. I've known Sam since his RSA days. It's always great to talk to another Boston guy. Um, and we're going to talk about some buzzwords, some digital trust and digital transformation, but all areas that I think are pertinent to a lot of the other CISOs and in the community out there, especially in the world of zero trust, which is an area and obviously Sam's company, Zscaler, and here at Veza that we're spending a lot of time on. And we're also going to talk a little about business initiatives, supporting remote work, et cetera. So I'm looking forward to touching on a lot of these things. So how are you doing today, Sam?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on. It's good to see you, Mike.
Yeah, you too, Sam. Thanks for so much for taking the time. Thanks for being on the show today.
My pleasure.
Let's start with, I know it is a buzzword, but I think it's an important concept. Let's start talking about zero trust. You and I have been talking about zero trust for a long time. But I guess I'll start by, what do you think and how do you think zero trust is, what we think about it now, say, versus what we thought about it even 5 years ago?
Well, I think first of all, it's a cool sounding phrase, right? I mean, who doesn't want, zero trust or several zero trusts, right?
Right.
And there's some formal definitions. NIST has a good one. And then people usually put some qualifiers like zero trust authentication or ZTNA or what have you. But if you can't explain something simply, you probably don't know it well enough. And for me, zero trust it's about some core principles like least privilege and least function. But if I'm talking to a business person, I usually say, it is about only allowing what the business needs when it needs it for as long as it needs it. And the reason for that is the more by default that you leave open, the more access there is, the more privilege there is, the more risk there is just sort of latent in the system. And so by closing that off, you're removing the kick me sign in some regards. The business has to be open to do business. You have to do transactions. The whole purpose of IT is to connect originally people and data to do transactions, but now it's more than just people. So you've got to do that. So only do that. And that's really what zero trust is about. Doesn't matter if you're talking about data-centric zero trust. Doesn't matter if you're talking about identity. Doesn't matter if you're talking about applications or network. It boils down to those principles, and they're really architectural principles. After that, it's just qualifiers and products being sold to help do that.
Yeah, it's funny. I always think about, it's long before the term zero trust came about, but before I became a CISO for the first time back in 2008, my job was in the B2B space, and we always debated about whether or not, and I know the answer to the question was yes, but we always debated about how the easy button, if you will, to get third parties connected to your network or to sign a contract with a business process outsourcer or whatever was basically to treat them like employees and give them access to everything.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that was the easy thing to do, but it was also a very, very risky thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that concept, fast forward to today, is still around because I think, in essence, I've been around doing this a long time as well as you have. I think one of the biggest areas that zero trust falls down, or at least achieving it, is that the knee-jerk reaction just to give, I think most companies' third-party workforce has far more access than they need.
Like, it was a different world back then, right? Yeah. And we all remember the Metcalfe's law diagram, right? You've got two dots and a line, and then 3 dots, and you've got 3 lines, and 4 dots, and so on. And it's a doily that expands. Metcalfe's law is that with a linear increase in the number of nodes, you get an exponential increase in the value of the network. That's the principle behind the internet. Mm-hmm. And so inherent in that, in all the RFCs we've written, is let's connect more. Let's connect more. It sounds great. I mean, let's connect more ports, more apps, more systems. Let's go, go, go. And in IT, what do? As soon as something doesn't work, we say, well, did you reboot? And then the next question is, can you ping? And it's that can you ping reflex that says if everything is open, everything's okay. And that's what we're changing, because that's no way to go into the future. Now the world is different. Even by 2008, we knew it, but we were beginning to feel it inherently. The big breaches were starting to come, not just the smaller ones we'd had, not just the lost passwords in those days, right? The stolen hash password files, because I know identity is a big thing here.
Yep.
It was more than that. It wasn't just the consumer services that were getting cracked. My own RSA in those days got hacked, right? 3 years later.
Yep.
The real issue is that there are more actors with more tools who've gotten better very, very quickly. And if you have that approach, it's not just not if and when, it happens immediately. And so
Mhm.
what we've got to do is make you less visible, leave less options. We've also got to introduce what I call negative trust, not just zero trust, which is the use of deception, right? You see, the bad guys should be scared to take a step on our networks. They should be looking at something and going, wow, I've got 100 doors. One of them leads to what I want. And the other 99, I'm going to get busted,
Yep.
right? That's the world we should be in. And you simply don't have available the options unless you have the right to see them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it is funny how the terms evolved. I remember when most people viewed zero trust as purely just a network segmentation challenge, but now we're
Mm.
realizing it's a combination, to your point, network, identity, access control. Uh, what do you think about all of these components from
Mm.
a zero trust perspective? I mean, obviously, I think we'd all agree, recognize the perimeter is gone, but
Yeah, yeah.
most big companies have a lot of stuff in the cloud, but they also have some on-premise. They're hybrid, and we all know that, especially accelerated with COVID, that everybody's working from everywhere. So, what are some of these things that are how all of those elements have shifted this?
Well, I think in the old days, we used to talk about the tug of war between the endpoint and the network, right? We tell
Yep.
was it a Microsoft world or a Cisco world? And how did it go back and forth? We had NAC and NAP, and everybody was like, I actually don't think that's the spectrum that matters. I think it's now data and identity.
Yep.
And the network has always been in between, but what I think we're going to do is with the actual physical network, it's a commodity. It should just be a connected medium. There's not much value that is added there at all. Instead, it's about authorization, fine-grained authorization at scale. It's about how do you make these decisions when you don't even necessarily know who the parties are who are going to speak, and how do you render them quickly. And so it's about connecting the identities. The identities are not just people. It could be machines, could be applications, could be what have you. And how do they then do transactions with data? That's the interesting thing. How do you get data centric, and how do you bring the identity context in and make those decisions on the fly? That's far more interesting. The world has become decoupled from that hardware of machine, which is effectively replaceable now, and from network, which is just a connected medium. And when you do that, things become more interesting. So rather than network segmentation, we live in a world of logical segmentation. We already segment users. We call that role-based or any number of things. And we have this notion of grouping and tagging and what are the properties that people have. And then we want to provision and say, well, okay, so what should they access? And rather than just say, let's just dump them on a network or let's give them access to a system, instead it's how do we provision them to a logical segment?
Yep.
How do you give them to a cluster of applications? And just that. And then how do you get fine-grained in terms of what they can do there? And that's possible now, but it's a rethinking. And by the way, when you actually do that, that's when that transformation happens. It becomes easier to manage. It becomes a lot cheaper and actually easier to troubleshoot and provide a great quality of service. So it is a have your cake and eat it too situation. You can in fact get less risk and make it a better user experience and a better quality connection altogether. But it's a whole different way of thinking about it. I remember back in my MCRSA days, Paul Maritz stood on stage and he said, most of IT, he said over 70% of IT's energy goes on keeping the lights on.
Hmm.
And less than 30% goes on the actual mission of application delivery. He said, what would it be like if we flipped that around? And I still ask that question today, because rather than be custodians of IT, most of IT should instead be brokers of IT and spending time delivering high value.
Yeah, yeah,
That's the transformation this enables.
yeah, you're absolutely right. I think every business, every industry, I mean, obviously some are further along than others, but every business and every industry needs data and digital to move
Mhm.
faster and to compete in today's economy. And
It's
we're all
it's a competitive advantage, the speed with which you can do it without introducing risk.
absolutely,
That's the key.
and obviously recognizing that a lot of the identity infrastructure that many big companies have inherited or have in place wasn't built for these demands, wasn't built for this world. What are some of the biggest challenges that you see in here? When identity and zero trust types of principles are required, just from an implementation or operationalization perspective. I know, for example, one of the things that I hear a lot about is the explosion of machine identities in cloud environments. But obviously, machine identity is a one thing, but the human part is obviously challenging as well.
Well, it's the key word I think is ephemeral. It is that these things are short-lived, and you don't necessarily know when they're going to appear. This could be machines, could be workloads. It's users that even we even talk about a gig economy, that users have a shifting role, and at some point in the day, at some point in their job cycle, and I mean very granularly, they may have certain rights they don't have at another point in their day. And how do they carry those around? And that's a different world of trust than it's ever been before. Zero trust isn't about actually zero. It's about getting as close to it as you need in order to do the job. And that is actually a shifting target based on with whom you're actually doing things. And I love this notion that there's more than just the identities of the individuals involved. We're actually in a multi-object world. And so I think of it in terms of subject, verb, object, right? So you've got nouns, you've got who's trying to do what to whom, and then you've got some context around it. And it's not just yes, no, it's also conditional. It's so what sorts of things are you going to allow? And native to the applications and native to the envelopes around the data, yeah, that we have permissions, right? The old CRUD stuff and what have you. But we can also do a lot in the authorization of those connections. We can say, yes, here's a condition. Yes, here's the way that you access it. You could do this, but not that. And I think we're getting closer and closer to better ways of doing that policy. There's some new technological breakthroughs. We don't have to keep doing IT like we've done it for generations.
Yeah. Oh man, you brought up nouns, subjects, and
oh yeah, I brought grammar into it. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, it reminds me of Sister Eileen in the third grade of diagramming sentences. Let's talk about all of this as well in the context of speed, because I know one of the things that's challenging in all of this is the speed of change. Mm-hmm. And I agree completely with what you're saying about being brokers, because one of the theories and the concepts that I believe is happening, and in some companies it already has, is that the whole notion of a quote unquote central IT team is eroding because the business needs to own technology and drive technology. That's happening with data. It's happening with SaaS. It's happening with DevSecOps when people are developing products, and they all need it yesterday. So I'm sure, obviously, in your day-to-day, you're seeing that shift as well.
Absolutely. But what we want to do is get closer and closer to software defined. We want to be getting away from having to a priori define exactly in a deterministic way what all the policies are going to be. What we want is a system that we can formally verify will behave correctly, that we can simply define, and that is effectively not bound to hardware and isn't just about, okay, let's give star.star access to everything. If, by the way, the best and most flexible and fastest solution is actually the simplest in terms of its architecture. And that's proven time and time again. It is the most scalable too. And so rather than build complicated environments, we can have complex configurations. We should seek by default the simplest ways to do that, mm-hmm. and support complexity without being complicated. And that isn't going to be done based on building on the bones of IT over the last 30 years. It's going to be done rethinking things. But the biggest challenges are in fact cultural when you do that.
Yeah.
It's not that we don't have the technical know-how to do it. It's that we've got many, many reasons not to. And the root cause of that is often cultural.
Yeah. Absolutely right. Yeah, and I also think that, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've been doing technology in major enterprises for God knows how long. Mm-hmm. And I know that we've always tried to link what we were working on to the business. And in many respects, obviously a few years ago, especially if you were in an infrastructure organization, that was not an easy thing to do. But nowadays, I think we're finally at a point where doing technology securely and delivering capabilities from a technology and a digital perspective with a zero trust mindset, understanding how important identity is. This is actually becoming, for the first in an era, if you will, a true business enabler and a business differentiator. I'm sure you agree with that.
I totally agree with that. Like, I used to joke I was the CTO of the world's largest keychain maker.
Yeah.
Right. And the reason that I said that was because we knew how to do it. We knew how to build a barrier. We talk about firewalls as barriers, and we talk about all the classic stuff, but authentication was too.
Yeah.
And doing continuous authentication is better, and doing stronger authentication is better, but you can also do stronger authentication that's less interruptive. But I remember wanting and lamenting 14 years ago the fact that we weren't doing authorization correctly.
Yep.
Scalable, fine-grained authorization. The tools now exist. And shame on us if we as a society aren't making that a major driver. The companies that do this, by the way, they go through massive, massive transformations in terms of IT capabilities and, frankly, reduction in terms of risk, less likely to have incidents, and the impact when they do is dramatically lower because you're becoming less visible when you do this. There are less options for lateral movement. There's less options for exfiltration. This is effectively a game changer. And if you're, you look at all the firewall vulnerabilities out there, let's assume that all vendors are the same in terms of quality. Just assume that. If you're a hacker, right, if you're working for one of these labs and you have to make a decision, where are we going to invest our R&D dollars to develop exploits? You go after the things that give you maximal access. Don't you want to just find the thing that tunnels through a wide open flat network? That's what you invest in.
Right.
By the way, that's the real reason. Take the quality of development aside, because I'm not going to slam any companies. That's the real reason that there's so many exploits for firewalls and VPNs. By the way, those things were great. I have patents in both.
Mm-hmm.
The reason, by the way, that they were great is they let us extend beyond the perimeter, and that helped us during COVID to some extent. But that's not the only option. We can actually now get far more granular and remove the risks associated with that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I have patent envy. My patents were with the Intel chip, and then there was a math coprocessor issue.
I did my time in the salt mines of identity management. I'm telling you. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I also wonder. Believe me, I'm never going to downplay the importance of authentication, especially with modern and better authentication. It's really, really important. But I do worry that we put too many eggs in that basket. Back to your point about how authorization.
Oh yeah, we should do it. Then what? Then what?
Yeah, but then one of the things I want to talk about though is, the real popular fad now is passwordless. And I always think about it. Maybe it's really philosophical, but as security leaders, we've almost always had to make a trade-off of user disruption with better security. And password is one of those examples where you can actually do both. You can improve experience and you can improve security. So I'm glad to see at least that part is happening, because you're right. I mean, you mentioned your RSA days, your world's most popular keychain days. That was viewed as tremendously powerful at the time, but it was viewed as obstructive.
Oh yeah, the Department of No, right?
Yeah,
and
right.
But I have to tell you, the medicine doesn't have to taste bad.
Yep.
Right. When the nurse comes by and says it's time for your medicine, it doesn't have to taste terrible. And the same is true when security comes by and says it's time to beef up security. It doesn't have to be painful.
Right.
So let's take authentication. I always think by default of authentication is the cost to break something, right? The cost to overcome proving you are that somebody is who they say they are. And so what is multi-factor authentication? It says the cost to break some factor A plus at least one other factor B. It's greater than the sum of those costs to break it. There's some difficulty in coordinating them together, right? And generally speaking, we want something different among something you are, have, or know, right? Why? Because we're trying to get that extra factor to be as difficult. So now the principle is, let's find the beefiest, hardest to break things that we can. By the way, a password's not one of them. There's other things we could be using for those. But there's also a flip side, that extra factor gets bigger when we use more factors with less friction or less pain to use. Yeah. And so if we actually have 30 things that are not hard to break, it's really hard to do them all synchronously. And we can start to monitor where you are in time, whether there's two of you, whether the behavior is changing. There's so many more options and opportunities for continuous authentication, for new factors, for combinatory factors, for actually working as partners in an ecosystem to do authentication better. I waxed poetic on authorization, but this one, the medicine doesn't have to taste bad, Mike.
Yeah, agree completely. It's tremendously impactful where you're going.
By the way, the reason that it does taste bad is because we have to have, I used to call it the double critical mass problem. You have to have someone like an RSA with enough places that it's accepted in order to be compelling to go buy it. And you have to have enough users that actually used it. So you have to have these two critical masses, or no one's going to actually use this authentication form factor. And so the ones who got there first were the ones that got most used. But in a cloud world, we don't have to do that. There's many more opportunities to break through that double critical mass problem.
Yeah, you're right. And in a minute, I'm going to shift gears a little bit to the people side. But it's funny you're talking about that, because just the whole human psychology thing. I remember when we were trying to move away from the tokens and go to another modern authentication capability. And it's funny, the human psychology was, we thought we were doing the right thing and quote unquote improving the experience. We thought the users were going to be happy, but we ran into so many people who it was kind of like a sense of security. They didn't feel comfortable turning it back in because they've been hearing us for so long telling them how secure it was. And then we were trying to take it away. They're like, wait a minute.
Do you want you want a vendor insider secret? Do you want one?
Oh yeah, of course.
So you know how those tokens, the RSA security tokens, weighed quite a bit?
Yeah.
Did you know that when we actually lightened them up and lowered the cost to manufacture, the average sales price went down? And we actually re-injected epoxy into them to make them heavier, and the average sales price went up.
Oh wow.
In other words, it's sort of like when you buy a car and you're like, why is there faux wood interior in this leather? You pay more for that. The packaging is the product. And I remember there was another benefit to the epoxy as well, which is that it meant less interference from radio frequencies. But at the end of the day, a couple of pennies worth of epoxy injected into a secure ID token meant the average sales price went up over $10, and we won more deals against those light, flimsy tokens that rattled like plastic.
Yeah. Well,
stuff I would have gotten in trouble for saying over a decade ago, but I don't now. So there you go.
One of those things where the only thing us geeks would say this, but every time I've moved over the last 15 years, the only thing that's consistently I find when we move is somewhere I find one of those
token. People used to have token necklaces, especially in like healthcare. They'd like to put colored tape around them, so they'd be like, "Oh, this one's for the heart monitor, and this one's for your IV." Horrible, right? But I actually have the big bone children, right? I've got the authenticator card that weighs a lot with the buttons on it. I've got it because of course, the function I had all the esoteric secure ID tokens too, the 250, for instance, not just the 700 or the 600.
Hey, one other quick topic here before we wrap up. We can't have a technology or security conversation without talking about our two favorite letters, AI.
Oh, geez, yeah.
But AI obviously plays a pretty big role in identity and zero trust. Helps us make better access decisions, detects anomalies, etc. But again, I always worry about the basics too. People keep an eye off the ball because they want to worry about the new sexy stuff. But how do we as security leaders and practitioners keep up with all this pace of change?
Well, I think the first principle we should have is we should be thinking about supply chain and third-party risk, because APIs are in fact the new control point, and so we should pay very close attention to the companies behind it. We did this with cloud. We can wrap our arms around it, but it means that we need to know where they're being used in the environment. And we also should, data protection isn't just DLP as in the old days, which was very much a compliance-driven thing or a necessary evil. No, it is in fact necessary to know which information is flowing through which channels, what is going to those AIs, because it's the combination of those two things that's really important.
Yep.
The second thing that I'd say is I don't generally trust what I call inductive AI rather than deductive. What I mean by that is send us your data, we'll figure something interesting out. Not interested, by the way, because even you don't know what you're going to do with the data, and that's scary.
Yep.
I'm interested in the deductive use cases, especially applicative, where you take some learning from somewhere to solve this problem, like data classification or finding malware or policy derivation. And by the way, there's many interesting use cases that startups could be doing right now and are not. Everybody's copilot. It's being done. We're all doing it. Okay. But things like deception are interesting. Things like generating policy for things like authorization, that's interesting. So I'm interested in my tenant or in a multi-tenant environment, how do you solve a problem? Go from the large to the small, not from take my data and go use it wherever. That's not interesting. So that's the general advice I'd give. And I've also heard a number of CISOs, colleagues of ours, who've now fallen into this trap where, because AI has come to mean more than AI and it's reached backwards in time to machine learning, which has been used for 25 years, right? We were finding malware with machine learning as far back as 2001 and fraud as far back as 2005. Now you go and say, oh, there's machine learning. And they go, ooh, that's AI. We need to put it through our committee. It's like, no, you've been using it for 15 years, right? So we need to be far more specific than just AI. And we need to start saying what sort, trained on what data, and what's the application, and who has access to it. These questions are fundamental. Even yesterday, I was talking to someone and they said, hey, don't worry, if you just don't put any bad stuff in, no bad stuff can come out. And that's wrong too.
Yep.
Back in the big data days, I remember asking Chuck Hollis this question. I said, how do I know it's big data? And I was looking for a technical definition. And he said, no, it's big data when it has the ability to create PII.
Oh, yeah.
And the same is true with AI. You need to be really understanding what it can bring to light, as well as how it can be abused and what can be stolen from it.
Yeah, Great closing thoughts. Speaking of buzzwords with the AI stuff that we were talking about before, but hey, Sam, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for sharing your insights, and appreciate you joining me.
Thanks for having me on, Mike. It's great to see you again.
You too. That wraps up today's episode of Identity Radicals. Thanks for tuning in. Remember, in the world of identity, radical thinking leads to radical security. To see more Identity Radicals content, please subscribe to the Identity Radicals podcast on YouTube by scanning the QR code on the screen. Take care, everybody.